Yeah.
Wait a second, we're just going live at the moment.
You've got
Okay,
okay.
we are now live. If you would like to take it away, David.
Okay, you've got another 5 people waiting to go in.
Don't worry about those. I'll deal with those.
Rabbi Selaznik is there.
Is he?
Yeah, ZM Selaznik.
Because he normally backs himself out. And we've got Shlomo Kryman there. He's waving.
David, do you want to?
Are we ready? Okay. Tonight we're very honoured to have a very special guest speaker with us. Elkan Levy has filled a number of communal offices in British Jewry, including President of the United Synagogue, Minister of both Belmont and Radlett Synagogues, and Minister for Small Communities. He chaired a committee that produced the latest edition of the Singer's Prayer Book, which has developed into the whole series of Corin Sachs Sidurium and Matzorium. Elkan made Aliyah to Israel in 2011 and now lives in Netanya. So, the Jews of Georgian England, how and why did the Jews begin to settle outside London? What was the connection between Jews and the Navy? Which shore is still located overlooking the harbour? Which shore was built by naval craftsmen? Why were the ladies banned from coming to shore in crinolines, which are hoop skirts? And which shochet's granddaughter-in-law might have become queen? So questions will only be after Elkan's talk. So get ready for plenty of questions. So please either use the chat room or the electronic hand in the participants bay. If you just wave your hand, we may not see you, so please use the other things. So over to Elkan.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Right. And you can see my little laser pointer.
Perfectly.
Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to talk to Edgware because I lived about 30 years of my life in Stanmore, and I used to come to Edgware from time to time. And as some of you may remember, my late parents-in-law, Diana and Mrs. Fisher, lived in Warwick Avenue, Edgware, and my father-in-law would come to the shul quite often, especially on Friday nights down the little passageway. And I've got a lot of very happy memories of your shul. What I'm going to talk to you about this evening is Georgia and England, roughly from about, extending it a bit, from about the resettlement in 1656 to about the middle of the 19th century. But most of that was Georgia and England. Let's start with this gentleman, Manasseh ben Israel. Manasseh ben Israel made an approach to Cromwell, or was partly approached by one of Cromwell's people, on the same day that Cromwell passed something called the Navigation Acts. And basically it was for the same reason. The Navigation Acts was something passed in 1651. It was the only act of Parliament that Charles II did not repeal. And the principle was that English trade had to be carried in English vessels. Ships' crews had to be 3/4 English, and certain products which were not produced in Britain, such as tobacco, cotton, and sugar, had to be shipped from the colonies only to England or to other English colonies and on British ships. It was an attempt, a very successful attempt, to grow the merchant navy and to grow British economy. At the same time, Cromwell was interested in bringing the Jews into England, not because necessarily He had a great love for Jews, although he was a very tolerant individual, but because the most of the Jews in Europe, a lot of the Jews in Europe at that stage were in Holland. And Holland was doing economically extremely well. It was doing well because the Jews from Spain had settled in Holland, and the Silicon Valley of the 17th century was actually the West Indies. So the Jews who were in Holland understood how to deal with the Spaniards in the West Indies. And Holland was doing economically very well, and Cromwell wanted the same thing for Britain. In 1660, at the end of the Commonwealth, Charles II was brought back to England as the king at the Restoration. And he liked Jews. He liked Jews for a number of reasons. First of all, because he was a very tolerant man. He was actually quite indifferent to religion, and he didn't particularly care what religion people were. Secondly, because he had spent 10 years and more wandering around the continent, and the Jews had been very good to him. They had lent him money when he needed it. They had given him information when he needed it. And he came to Britain and he found a Jewish community that was really just beginning. I mean, Manasseh ben Israel's community was founded in 1656, so the community was only 4 years old. They also weren't terribly sure how strong they were going to be. And Charles, having wandered all over Europe, was not totally sure whether he was going to keep his throne, because if they'd cut off his father's head, they could do the same to him. So he thought he'd better keep on the right side of the Jews. And then he married this lady, Catherine of Braganza. Very nice lady, very intelligent lady. Didn't have any children, put up with her husband's notorious womanizing, and actually he was very fond of her. But what was interesting is that the match was suggested by a group of Portuguese Maranos. She was a Portuguese princess, and the leader of the Portuguese group that came with Catherine of Braganza was a man called Duarte de Silva. He was a Marano, and at the end of his life, he came with Catherine and he settled in London, and he openly professed Judaism. And there was another Marano who came with her called Fernando Mendes da Costa, who was responsible for looking after the dowry. It was a hell of a lot of money. So the Portuguese crown trusted him with the money. And there are still Mendes da Costas who are members of Bevis Marks. When Charles II came to the throne, the Lord Mayor and the Corporation of London wanted Charles to expel the Jews, and he refused. And they settled in London, and they set up as a synagogue in a rented property in Church Lane. We've actually got some quite interesting descriptions. There was a man called John Greenhall who came there in 1662, and he said he came into the synagogue and the men were there, and on the floor were 3 low seats whereon sat their sons, richly veiled, as gentle, comely one should see, who each had his service book in Hebrew without points, and were as ready in it and all their postures as the men. And then there's a little boy who comes in, and the priest, who was probably a man called Moses Atias, went up to the Rav, who put his talit on, and then he came and looked at Greenhall, as he said, probably wondering why I didn't have a veil, and then he goes to his mother. But the most interesting account of the shul comes from that gossip and diarist Samuel Pepys. And let me read this piece to you. on Wednesday, 14th of October, 1663. Thence home, and after dinner, my wife and I, by Mr. Rawlinson's conduct, to the Jewish Synagogue, where the men and boys in their veils, that's talesim, and the women behind a lattice out of sight, and some things stand up, which I believe is their law in the press, to which all coming in do bow, and at the putting on their veils do say something, to which others that hear him to cry Amen, and the party to kiss his veil, their service all in a singing way and in Hebrew. And anon their laws that they take out of the press are carried by several men, 4 or 5, several burdens in all, and they do relieve one another. And whether it is that everyone desires to have the carrying of it, I cannot tell. Thus they carried it round about the room while such a service is singing. And in the end they had a prayer for the king, which they pronounced his name in Portugal, but the prayer, like the rest, in Hebrew. But Lord, to see the disorder, laughing, sporting, and no attention but confusion in all their service, more like brutes than people knowing the true God, would make a man forswear ever seeing them more. And indeed I never did see so much, or could have imagined there had been any religion in the whole world so absurdly performed as this. The problem was that Pepys had gone to the shul on Simchas Torah. And what's also very interesting, actually, is because it was a Wednesday, in those days they had hakafot for mincha as well. That's what he must have been there, because he says after dinner, which means after lunch. In 1664, there's something called the Conventical Act, which aims to say there shall be no assembly for prayer except for under the rights of the Church of England. And 2 wide boys, Mr. Paul Rycourt and the Earl of Berkshire, go and see the Jews and say, look, boys, it'll be all right. Just cross our palms with silver. We know how to bribe. And the Sephardim were not going to fall for that. And with their rabbi, Jacob Sasportas, they went to see Charles II. And they found him in Whitehall, surrounded by his dogs and his mistresses, laughing and spitting. And they told him of their problem. And you can imagine this because the Sephardim were very short men. They were about 5 foot tall. And Charles II was described once as being above 2 yards high. He was over 6 foot. And Charles said to them that they should not worry and that they should come to him if they were in trouble. And he sent their request to the Privy Council, who in August 1664 assured the Jews that they might live unmolested so long as they demean themselves peaceably and quietly, with due obedience to His Majesty's laws and without scandal to his government. This last phrase, without scandal to his government, was understood to mean no conversions, because that would cause problems with the Church of England. And that's held to be one of the reasons that conversion in London has always been quite difficult. In 1665, the rabbi of the shul, Jacob Sasportas, flees back to Amsterdam, and Moses Attias, who is the chazan, dies. There's a gradual development of the community. There were 20 families in 1656 and 35 in 1660, and by 1688 there were over 800 souls in the community. There were no Jewish taxes. William III once tried to tax the Jews, but this didn't come off. But there was an odd sort of tax, and there was a big dispute in the community about it. If you lived in a particular parish, and all of them lived in a parish of a church, you were told when it was your turn to be church warden. And if you didn't want to take up the office, you paid a fine. The great synagogue in Duke's Place operated in a similar system, and so did Bevis Marks. It was because Benjamin Disraeli's father, Isaac Disraeli, wasn't prepared to be the Parnas Presidente of Bevis Marks, nor was he prepared to pay the fine, that he had his children baptized into the Anglican faith. There was a dispute among the Jews about this custom of being church warden, because if the Jews were picked as church wardens, they had to pay the fine. And some people said this is a deliberate tax that is levied upon the Jews because they know that we can't do this job. And others said, no, we are being treated like every other citizen of this particular parish, and it's a very good thing. We're being treated like ordinary citizens. When William II invaded in 1688, the firm called Machado and Pereira, who were Sephardim, organized the commissariat for the Irish expeditions, the Orangemen, the Battle of the Boyne that they've just celebrated. And the Jewish community was much involved in supplying armies and navies, and we'll see that that became a particular Jewish trade. Solomon de Mendina, who was the first Jew to be knighted, supplied all of Marlborough's campaigns. In 1701, the Sephardim moved from their little rented property in Creechurch Lane. They moved around the corner into Bevis Marks. It's a magnificent shul, and if you haven't been there, you really must go to look at it. There's a tradition that Queen Anne gave them a beam from a ship, or possibly from a ship in the Spanish Armada, which was incorporated into the roof of the building. And there's also a tradition that the builder, who was a Quaker called Joseph Aves, returned the profit on the contract to the synagogue, saying that he would not profit from the building of a house of God. In 1702, when the shul was opened, they appointed as their chacham this gentleman, David Nieto. Nieto was an Italian, he was a scholar, he was a qualified doctor, and he was a scientist. He wrote a number of very interesting books, one of which is called Bina Li'itim, Understanding the Times. It was the first scientific attempt to fix the times that Shabbat came in and went out in London. And for many years, the Sephardim on a Friday afternoon would send around their shamas, accompanied by two assistants, to the Ashkenazi Great Synagogue, which was next door. And they would then be met by the shamash of the Great Synagogue with two assistants. And the Sephardi shamash would inform his Ashkenazi colleague of the times of Shabbat for the following weekend. This went on for a long time. I think this custom must have terminated either before or at the beginning of the Great War, the First World War, because my Zayda, who was the shamas of the Great Synagogue, didn't know about this custom. But as well as the Sephardim, who were pretty wealthy, there was an increasing but very poor Ashkenazi settlement in London. The Sephardim were very happy to admit the Ashkenazim who were wealthy, such as a certain Benjamin Levy, who discounted in those days up to £100,000 worth of government bills. That's £100,000 at 1690 money. It's an awful lot of money. But they were burying the poor Ashkenazim, and they got a bit fed up with it. So in 1693, they summoned the leaders of the Ashkenazi community, whom they describe as the Mahamad, that's their term for a board of management, the Mahamad of the Tedescos, and told them that after 6 months, they would no longer bury poor Ashkenazim, and they should find their own cemetery. It took a little longer, but in 1697, Benjamin Levy purchased the land that the United Synagogue still maintain. It is the Aldeny Road Cemetery. It's not normally open, but it's down in the East End, it's near Stepney Green, but it is actually open on Tisha B'Av. And there are quite a lot of people who go there. There's some interesting graves. One of the chief rabbis who will come to, and the Baal Shem of London. At the same time, at about 1680s odd, this gentleman arrived from Breslau to work with his kinsman, this Benjamin Levy, who we have mentioned, and he became very, very wealthy. He involved himself in the shul from the beginning, and in due course, in 1690, he founded an Ashkenazi shul, which from the beginning was known as the Great Synagogue of London, Beit HaKnesset HaGadol. But it was generally known as Moses Hart's shul. And Hart and his son-in-law, Isaac Franks, bought a lottery ticket in 1719 and won £20,000 at 1719 money. And with it, he built himself this beautiful country house at Isleworth. A lot of the members of the Great Synagogue had country homes. At Isleworth, Brentford, where he would go during the summer. And of course, it's on the river because that meant that he could travel by boat and he didn't have to go along the very bad roads. There had been a rabbi of the Great Synagogue called Judah Leib Cohen, and he had had a row with the gabbai of the shul, who was a man called Rabbi Beryl London. Beryl London had a rabbinical degree, but he didn't use it. He was a wealthy merchant, and he wanted to get rid of Judah Leib Cohen, so he bribed the shamas one morning to cut off one of the rabbi's tzitzit during Shacharit. This was not only reflected badly on the rabbi, but if any of you have done tahara, preparing the dead for burial, you'll know that we put a talit around a man, but we cut off one of the tzitzit. So the implication for Judah Leib Cohen that he was going to die very soon was too much, and he went back to Rotterdam. And Moses Hart appointed his brother Aaron Hart as the rabbi of the synagogue, and Aaron Hart remained the rabbi of the Great Synagogue for 50 years. The Great Synagogue went through a series of buildings. In 1722, Moses Hart built a new shul at his expense, and it was rebuilt in the 1760s and then finally rebuilt in 1790, to which his daughter, Judy Levy, gave £4,000, which was almost the whole of the cost. And this is the Great Synagogue, the exterior of the Great Synagogue, and this is the interior of the 1791 building. The drawing is by Rawlins, is by Ackerman, but the figures were added in by the artist Rawlinson. And this building lasted exactly 150 years. It was opened in 1791, and it was finally destroyed. It was destroyed in the last night of the Blitz, 10th of May, 1941. Each congregation, including the Sephardim, had a doctor whose position in the shul was that he looked after the sick members of the synagogue, whether or not they could afford his fees. And it was such an important position, that the surgeon to the Great Synagogue sat in the warden's box with the wardens. Now, of course, communities develop by splitting. It wasn't very long before Aaron Hart did what we call a get out tanai, a conditional bill of divorce, for some communal ne'er-do-well who was about to leave for the West Indies. We still use this procedure today. It's you can divorce your wife on condition that she is divorced if you don't come back within a certain period of time. It's something that soldiers do if they go into the army. He did this, Aaron Hart did this get out tanai procedure on a Sunday afternoon in August 1706. But he had a member called Moses Hamburger who thought he knew as much as the rabbi. That's one of the occupational hazards of being a Rov. And that evening he said, no, he said, I'm telling you, the rabbi got it wrong. He didn't spend enough time, and I will wager £5, which was a lot of money, that what he did is not valid. This was quite an insult to the rabbi, and there was a row. Aaron Hart was a very peaceful man, and he got hold of this man, Mordechai Hamburger, or Moses Hamburger, and said to him, look, if you will apologize, I will make sure that you're called up in the shul on Rosh Hashanah. Wow. And that might have settled the whole thing, except that the warden of the synagogue was this man, Rabbi Beryl of London, whom we've already encountered. And he didn't like Mordechai Moses Hamburger because both of them had been courting the same lady, a daughter of the well-known Jewish diarist Gluckel of Hamelin, and the daughter had married Hamburger and not Rabbi Beryl of London, and the chance to put something over his old enemy was too good. And he said to Rabbi Hart, don't you dare forgive him, he is to go into Cherem. That was serious. It was serious on Rosh Hashanah, and it was serious on Yom Kippur. But then there was a problem with Sukkot. The Ashkenazim had ordered their etrogim from Tangier in North Africa, and the winds were contrary and the ships couldn't sail. The Sephardim had ordered theirs from Livorno in Italy, so they came over land. And when the Sephardim got their etrogim, they sent round to their Ashkenazi brethren one etrog, so that it could be passed round the shul. And when it got to Moses Hamburger, they said, no, you can't have that. You're in Cherem, you were not allowed to have it. So he did the only thing he could do, and he built a shul in the garden of his house in Fenchurch Street. And this is the Hamburger Synagogue, which was built. This building is the 1725 building, it was the second building, and it lasted until 1893. And as far as I can tell, this is the only picture of the inside of the synagogue. But it's really quite interesting because look at this. This is the front row of seats, and here are backrests, bookrests, but you can't possibly use those unless you're standing up. And this was a community that must have had quite a lot of money. This is a mantle from the Hambro, which is in the Jewish Museum. Beautiful thing. Here is the detail in the middle of the Aron Kodesh, an amazing piece of embroidery. The problem is that the embroidery is not done in cotton, it's done in wire. And this mantle is so heavy that it is a two-man lift. I don't think they could ever have actually used it because the chazan could not have carried the Sefer Torah. And they had, this is the Hamburger Synagogue, which is also in the Jewish Museum. Look at that beautiful barley sugar work on the brass upstand. And this is a reading desk that belonged to the Hambro, which is currently in the New West End Synagogue. But look at this beautiful carving. This was a community that had money. The next breakaway was the new synagogue in Leadenhall Street. And they broke away in 1761 because they complained that they weren't being called up often enough. One of the great things about Georgian shul rows is that the dates are different and the people are different, but the rows are instantly recognizable. And they bought the livery hall of the Worshipful Company of Tilers and Bricklayers in Leadenhall Street. They converted it into the new synagogue, although the livery company kept the wine cellar, which led to the rhyme, "The spirits above are spirits divine, but the spirits below are spirits of wine." In 1837, the new synagogue moved to its magnificent new building in Great St. Helens, which afterwards went to Egerton Road. And the new synagogue had a lot of furniture to get rid of. And at that time, the Cheltenham Shul was being built. And they gave the furniture to Cheltenham, who had to pay 80 odd pounds, which is an awful lot of money in those days, to have it transported there. This is Cheltenham Shul, which I know very well because it's a small community. It's one of the shuls that I look after, and my partner Andy and I all usually go there when we're in England. But this is the 1751 furniture. You can see these are the original benches. The cushions are new, but the rattan backs are original. And on the wall, there is this prayer for the royal family. It's gold and painted on black, gold lettering on black painted canvas. And you see it says Queen Victoria and all the royal family. It doesn't list the members of the royal family, but it's much older than that, because when this was restored some years ago, behind Queen Victoria was George IV, behind him George III, and behind him George II. George II came to the throne in 1727, but on the back of this frame, there is the name of Cole and Kings, who were a firm that we know went out of business in 1730. So this must have been manufactured between 1727 and 1730. It must have been made originally for the Great Synagogue in Duke's Place, and it is the oldest Ashkenazi synagogue relic anywhere in the UK. Small communities. A lot of the Jews were peddlers. You have to remember, England is largely an agricultural society. There are peddlers who go around the different farms with trays of goods, ribbons, sewing stuff that they might have needed, various small stuff that they needed in the households. And Jewish communities began to grow like this. Somebody would go down and establish a round, and then he would send for 9 young men, and they'd come down there. And the idea was that on a Sunday morning, they would all cash up, and the wholesaler would give them some more goods, and they'd disappear on their various rounds. But they had to be back at base next Friday so that they could have a minyan for Shabbat. Sometimes one of them would be paid extra money by the other members of this community, so he'd come back on Thursday and do the cooking. And there were inns that had sets of Jewish pots and pans, which were kosher. And how did they know they were kosher? Well, once you'd used it, you had to get a piece of chalk and write inside the pan in Hebrew. This presupposes quite a high level of literacy. You had to write your name in Hebrew, you had to write the Sedra of the week in Hebrew, and you had to write the Hebrew date in the Hebrew, on the basis that if you came and you found that writing undisturbed, then no Gentile had touched the pan. Sometimes if the wholesaler, as it were, had daughters, he'd marry them off to these young men. And if not, then the young Jewish guys would sometimes convert the local milkmaid. Why the milkmaid? Well, you'll no doubt recall Jenner's theory of that Jenner, who discovered that milkmaids didn't get smallpox because they had cowpox. And since they didn't get smallpox, they had much better complexions. And the Jewish boys knew exactly what they were doing. There's one interesting story of an innkeeper's wife in Kent who refused to give his breakfast to a Jewish traveler because she said he had not yet put his straps on, hadn't laid to fill in. And one of the incidental byproducts of this was the Jewish rise in pugilism. Daniel Mendoza became one of the leading boxers, but he did that in order, Jews became interested in boxing in order to protect peddlers who were traveling around from farm to farm. And then Jewish communities spread into the provinces, especially to the coastal cities, Chatham, Portsmouth. Portsmouth at one time was the largest provincial community. Plymouth, Falmouth, because ship's chandlery was a particularly Jewish business. And then you've got the Solomons family. There was a family called Solomons who lived in Dawlish, which is near Plymouth. And Solomons either employed a shochet or was the shochet, I'm not quite clear. He emigrated to America and his son changed the name to Simpson. And his grandson became a very successful shipbroker on Wall Street and very pro-English. And when the First World War broke out, he volunteered as an officer in one of the Guards regiments. He had a very good war. And he married an American divorcee, and they set up home at number 5 Bryanston Court, round the corner from Marble Arch, where the Western Marble Arch Shul is to this day. And they tried to launch themselves into society, but like many expatriates, they tended to associate with other expatriates. One of their friends was an American called Thelma, Lady Furness, who was a Vanderbilt. And on one occasion, she said to her friend, the wife of the grandson of the shochet of Dawlish, I'm going to America, would you look after my boyfriend? And the wife of the grandson of the shochet of Dawlish said, yes, of course. And the rest was history, because the wife of the shochet of Dawlish was Wallace Simpson. And her boyfriend was Albert Edward Christian George Andrew Patrick David, more familiarly known to us as King Edward VIII. Interestingly, Ernest Simpson, then after he had divorced Wallace, married again, had a son who discovered his Jewish ancestry, made Aliyah, and served as an officer in the IDF. Let's look at some synagogues down in the West Country, because these are Georgian synagogues. This shul in Plymouth was opened in 1762. I had the honor of doing the 250th anniversary service with Jonathan Sachs. That's the exterior, quite plain, and that's the interior. It's beautiful shul. Look at the woodwork at the back of the bimah, because we know from the joints that were used in the construction that this work was done by craftsmen from the naval dockyards, because the wood joints are joints that were particularly used in the building of ships. You can almost imagine this rail at the back of one of Nelson's ships. This is the Aron Kodesh. The shul is still used. It is the Ashkenazi shul with the longest unbroken record of use in Europe. This is magnificent Aron Kodesh, was probably brought from either Holland or North Germany as a sort of Georgian flat pack. That's another view of the bimah. The original 1762 conveyance of the land mentions these 8 brass candelabra that's still there. I've been there many, many times. This is the prayer for the royal family. It's different from the normal text we use. Uses the old beginning, who delivered his servant David from the hurtful sword, makes a way in the seas and the path in the mighty waters. This is King George V, pre-1925, because Queen Alexandra died in 1925. But look at this. O Lord, King of kings, of thy goodness, we beseech thee to raise and remount the planet and fortune of his said majesty's arms, that his enemies may fall under his feet. And we beseech thee to prolong his days in his kingdom, It's a military town and it's a military prayer. 40 odd miles to the northeast of Plymouth. Oh, and this is Plymouth Cemetery, opened in 1744, and it's still there and it's still maintained by the shul. If you go down there into Plymouth, contact the custodian, who is a guy called Jerry Sibley, one of the most knowledgeable non-Jews who I have ever come across. And there are audio trails around this cemetery, and he gives introductions to the shul, etc., etc. He's very good. 40 odd miles to the northeast is Exeter. Exeter is 2 years younger than Plymouth. It has a fairly roughly similar arc, but Exeter did not have the same sort of money. So this magnificent Oren Kodesh is actually all wood. The painting of the marble and the gold, etc., is all painted on wood. When they did an investigation some years ago, they found 36 different Georgian paint colors. It's very interesting, Exeter, because to begin with, the ark was not in the east, and this is a rant. Somebody who had been agitating for years to have the ark, the shul rebuilt, which it was, and he put this up, and every time he has the word Yerushalayim, he puts a dash there. Shalu shalom, Yerushalayim, Yeshayu Im eshkachech, if I forget you, Yerushalayim, tishkach yamini. But obviously this is done by a non-Jewish stonemason, because look at that tzadi, that really should be an aleph. He obviously did not know quite what he was doing. And this is a view of the shul. This is a wedding that I did in Exeter in 2005. It was taken from the ladies' gallery, but what's really interesting is this bimah, because it is neither square nor rectangular. It is the only shul that has a bimah that is egg-shaped. And then there were communities also in Cornwall. This is the Panzans Cemetery. Penzance shul, actually the building still exists, but it is so dangerous they are not allowed to go in. But this is a listed monument. It's actually now maintained by the Penzance Town Council. It has some quite interesting graves. This is the grave of Rabbi B.A. Simmons. I won't take up your time going through it in detail, but they had somebody who really knew how to write inscriptions on matzevahs. It's very interesting. But there's also the grave of his 8-year-old daughter, who died of cholera on a Shabbat, and it says v'nikbara b'yom Shabbat b'pnei hamagefa. She was buried on Shabbat. They did the funeral on Shabbat because of the plague. Why? Partly because the plague was so contagious, but also because plague victims were normally seized and buried in an unmarked mass grave, and they didn't want that to happen to her. But we know what Rabbi and Mrs. Simmons looked like, because these are pictures that were done of them. These are pictures in the Penzance, in the Penley Art Gallery. And this is a picture of an old Jew who was probably Simmons' predecessor. John Opie finished up as George III's court painter. But when I looked at this picture, I was really fascinated, because look, he's wearing tefillin. It's very, very clear. If you go a little towards the east from Penzance, you come to Falmouth. Falmouth had a big, sizable Jewish community. It started with a group that went to Falmouth as a group. They knew what they were doing. They didn't just wander into England. They wanted to come to Falmouth. And they built this shul. This is the second building. And because their trade was dealing with ships chandlery, they supplied ships. And because Falmouth is the first large natural harbor when you come up from the Bay of Biscay, they didn't put the shul down on the quayside. They put it one level up so that somebody could pop out of the shul from time to time and see if any ships were coming into the harbor so they would know what business they had to do on Shabbat, after Shabbat. And Falmouth also has a Georgian cemetery. This is the gravestone of somebody called Alexander Moses, but he's known to history as Zenda, which is a diminutive of Alexander, of Zenda Falmouth. And this is his son-in-law, Moses Jacob. Moses Jacob was a very inoffensive little watchmaker. But he was married to Sarah, who was the daughter of Zenda Falmouth. And she was very frum, according to family tradition, and I've met her descendants. She used to lay tefillin in the morning. And she really wanted to be the president of the shul, but she couldn't because she was a woman. That's why she got her husband appointed as president. He ran the shul and she ran him. The largest of all the provincial communities in those days was Portsmouth, and it was responsible for a significant event in the establishment of the chief rabbinate, which I won't go into, but there was a row. But when they built this ark dates from 1780, but when they moved it to Southsea in the 1936, they took the ark with them, which was a good thing because the original building was flattened in the Blitz. And Portsmouth has a coat of arms on the front of the ladies' gallery. It's not quite sure why, but there is a story that George III was once inspecting his fleet in Portsmouth, and a big storm grew up, and he got back to land with difficulty. And when he did, he said, "Take me to the nearest house of God that I may give thanks." And it happened to be the shul. So that's why they have the royal arms. And Jews were involved in all sorts of financial things. This is Lloyd's Coffee House, which was afterwards became Lloyd's of London, the insurance market. And one of the people who had the idea of creating an insurance market was an Ashkenazi Jew called Philip Heilbert in 1720. There was an act in 1753 called the Jew Bill, which would have given Jews the right to become citizens, but there were some riots and it was withdrawn. But then in 1760, the Sephardim, when George III came to the throne, the Sephardim attended upon the king with an address of loyalty. And the Parnasim, the wardens of the great synagogue, objected as not being included. And in future, they decided that in future they would do it jointly, and they established the London Committee of British Jews, which is now known as the Board of Deputies of British Jews. It dates from 1760, and it reflects the fact that the Ashkenazim were more and more important. There was a lady called Catherine Villarreal who in 1727 was persuaded to marry a man called Joseph Mendes da Costa, who was actually old enough to be her grandfather. They were married in 1727. She gave birth to a son in 1728 and a daughter in 1729. And to celebrate this, the proud father founded a school, the Villarreal School. He died in 1731, leaving a beautiful widow of 22 with a fortune of perhaps £200,000, which was a huge amount of money. And to cut a long story sideways, she married out and had her children baptized. But the Villarreal School existed. And we know that in 1729, the teacher was paid £30 per annum plus 24 sacks of coal. And the school day ran from 7 o'clock in the morning, 7 to 8 Hebrew reading, 8 to 9, 3 Ra'ahs in English, 9 to 10 the same in Spanish or Portuguese, from 1 to 2 sewing, from 2 to 4 embroidery, and from 4 to 5 Hebrew. The building of the Villarreal School was in Thrall Street, and afterwards it became the Tree of Life Theological College, otherwise known as the Yeshiva Eitz Chaim, which is where I was a student, and so was my father, and so was my Zayda. In 1756, Aaron Hart, the rabbi of the Great Synagogue, died, and he succeeded by a man called Hart Lyon, or Herschel. But he only lasted 6 years and then went back to be the rabbi of Mannheim and then Berlin. But there were some quite interesting laws in his time. One was they said that men could carry swords to shul on Shabbat, provided that they had wooden blades. You could actually do quite a lot of damage with a wooden blade. And in any case, if you had it in a scabbard, then somebody was going to attack you, wouldn't know that it was wood. And in 1755, the wardens of the Great Synagogue said that women may not come to shul in crinolines, those are big hooped skirts, because there simply isn't enough room in the ladies' gallery to get them. After Hart Lyon, there was a dispute. There was a man called Meshulam Zalman who was appointed by the Hamburger Synagogue and the New Synagogue, but the Great Synagogue appointed David Teveler Schiff. He officiated in the first building, consecrated the second, and consecrated the third building in 1791. He came from Germany. He was a very scholarly man. He bemoaned the lack of intellectual stimulation in London. We know about his household. His wife died soon after they came to London, and her niece came to keep house for him, afterwards becoming his daughter-in-law. But the things that he kept under his control, there were three things. One was the purchase of nightcaps. One was the purchase of handkerchiefs, which had to be colored because he was addicted to snuff. And one was the purchase of lottery tickets. Teveler, we know about him because his brother Meir was the rabbi of Copenhagen, and the correspondence between the two of them still exists. And one of the people who was active in those days was this character, Meir Lyon. Meir Lyon was a singer, perhaps even a chazan, or an acting chazan, but certainly a singer. But he had a beautiful voice, and he was very well known for it. And he used to moonlight singing Italian opera for Mr. Handel under the name of Michael Leone. And on one occasion, Dr. Samuel Wesley, who was the brother of John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, came with somebody else to listen to Michael Leone, Meir Lyon, take the service. And he was very struck with Leone's setting of Yigdal. And Samuel Wesley went back and wrote a hymn to it. The God of Abraham praised, who reigns enthroned above, ancient of everlasting days and God of love. Now great I am, by earth and heaven confessed. I bow and bless the sacred name, forever blessed. That hymn is in the Hymns Ancient and Modern, the Anglican Church's hymn book, and the music is simply given as Leone. And one of the other characters in London was this guy, the Baal Shem of London, Dr. Samuel Jacob Chaim de Falk. He was a bit of a so-called miracle worker. He had two places of business. One was on London Bridge, the old London Bridge, and one was in Epping Forest. He always had issues with the Great Synagogue, although he had his own shul in Well-Close Square of Cable Street, but when he died, he left these two beautiful Sifrei Torah to the Great Synagogue. They're now in the Jewish Museum. These are very unusual because they look like Ashkenazi Sifrei Torah, but they have these hard silver cases and very, very small writing, but they're really beautiful. Among the people who were devotees of Samuel Jacob Chaim de Falk was a man who was the king of Corsica. And he went to Falk and he said, shall I ally Corsica with the Italians or with the French? And de Falk said, do it with the French. That's why Napoleon Bonaparte was a Frenchman and not an Italian. This is the Chazan, Isaac Polak, interesting looking man. This is David Levy, who was a hat maker, but he was a very considerable scholar. He translated the Machzorim into English, translated the Siddur into English, translated the Chumash into English. This is a Shavuot Machzor that I have from 1796. And I got this actually from the New West End Synagogue because it must have been in use at the end of the 19th century. And this is his Shavuot Machzor, with at the back there's a list of subscribers, but look at them. Lazarus Hart, that's Lemon Hart, you know, the rum man from Penzance, and Samuel Hart from Plymouth. And on the next page, there's Samson Lucas of Jamaica. So these had a big circulation. This is Solomon Herschel. He was the rabbi of the Great Synagogue. He was the first person to be known as the chief rabbi. You see, it says here, chief rabbi of the German and Polish Jews in England. He was the first of only 3 chief rabbis to have been born in England because his father, Hart Lyon, was the rabbi of the Great Synagogue, as we've seen, for 6 years, and Herschel was born in England. The other 2 chief rabbis who were born in England were Sir Israel Brodie and Lord Sachs. But he was the last of the old-fashioned rabbis of the Great Synagogue, and if he preached, it was rarely and in Yiddish. When he died in 1842, he was a very wealthy man. He's reputed to have played the stock exchange, and we have some books on mathematics which have his own annotations in them. But when that happened, the community decided that they wanted a modern university-educated chief rabbi. The effect of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars between 1789 and 1815 meant there had been almost no immigration into England for 25 years. By the middle of the 19th century, most English Jews were 2nd or 3rd generation English born. Jews born in England were citizens of the state. The legal disabilities that they faced were generally the same as those faced by anyone who was not a member of the Church of England. The social changes that followed the end of the Napoleonic Wars encouraged the Jews to participate in the full civic and political life of the nation. And that was the big struggle of the 19th century, waged between Moses Montefiore, David Salomons, who was the first Jewish Lord Mayor of London, and ultimately Baron Lionel de Rothschild, who was the first Jewish MP and who took his seat in July 1858. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is another lecture altogether. Thank you for listening to me.
You actually could have gone on for another couple of hours. I wouldn't have minded. It was really very, very fascinating, and I thought I knew history, but what you came out with was quite amazing. Before I start asking questions, there are in the chat box, there's some interesting people in there that have made some interesting. So I'd like to go through that first before.
Pleasure.
And was all right. First of all, do you know Shlomo Kryman?
Probably, but I have to tell you.
Right, but he's got a wonderful sense of humour. But he started off by saying "boo," and I'm not quite sure what that meant. But anyway, he then after "boo," he said, "Were the navigation apps the forerunner of the sat nav?"
Oh, that it were true. You know the old joke, why did Moses take 40 years to get from Egypt to Palestine to Israel? Because he didn't have a sat nav. No, but but interesting idea.
Okay, now we've got somebody else that you know, Rabbi Selaznik. And he says, "Dear Elkan, I promise to behave." So that's a good start. And then he gets a bit more serious, and he says, hold on a second, where is he? Oh, right, he says, James II and the Seventh were disposed in 1688. 1685 was the year Charles II died, and it was about Charles that Elkan said he was uninterested in religion, albeit he may have converted to Catholicism
on his deathbed.
I'm not sure. Is that a question?
No, it's
a statement. Yeah.
It is a statement. That was actually one of the problems, because James II was very much interested in religion and very much interested in Roman Catholicism, and Charles II had a sardonic indifference to religion. He put up with it, but didn't want to get too much involved, and that's why he was so tolerant.
Yeah. I've got Robert Bieber. Do you know Robert Bieber?
Yeah.
He sounds like he knows you. Elkan, you're always a pleasure to listen to, and your erudition is amazing. Just a thought, James II was deposed in 1685 in the Glorious Revolution due to his Roman Catholicism. Yet you say he was uninterested in religion.
No. Charles II was uninterested in religion.
Not James II.
Not James II.
Sorry, Robert, but Okay, I think we're nearly finished there.
No, we've got some questions.
Have you got more questions?
Amongst other. I just wonder, Elkan, extremely interesting, but I was just wondering, obviously the time of the Jew Bill and the anti-Semitism that was part of the reason why it was repealed the following year. How rife was anti-Semitism throughout the country anyway?
You have to remember that most people had never come across Jews. Yes, there was anti-Semitism because that was what the church was doing all the time. It was very much the Jews are responsible for killing our Lord. There was growing gently during the 18th century a feeling that religion should not necessarily interfere in everything, and that toleration was a great thing. This is one of the reasons, for instance, that led to the rise of Freemasonry, in which I'm very interested and active. The idea that a man's religion was his business and it should not stop people of different religions interacting. The Jew Bill was somewhat of an anomaly, and the reaction to it. There were, for instance, a number of quite interesting converts, of whom the most interesting was a man called Lord George Gordon, who had actually led the Gordon riots in London against the Bank of England, which had led the Bank of England to this day to have an armed guard there every night. Lord George Gordon then converted. He was a Scottish nobleman. He converted to Judaism, and he was wanted for a number of things, for debt and possibly treason and so on. So he fled London and he went to ground in the Jewish community in Birmingham, which in those days was in an area called the Froggeries, which is now under New Street Station. And they sent people up to arrest him, and they arrived on the Friday afternoon of Shabbos Hanukkah. And he said, I'm not going to come back to London with you. He said, it's Shabbos. We're not going until tomorrow night. And he was taken down to London and went into Newgate Prison, where he lived for quite a few years in great comfort, assisted by a lady called Miss Esther Levy, about whom there are some fairly scurrilous rumors. And he had a minyan there every Shabbos. And there's quite interesting a letter from somebody who wanted to come and see George Gordon. And he said to him, I won't see you. He said, tarry in Fenchurch Street until thy beard be grown. You're clean shaven. So there were people fairly high in the aristocracy who were very much in favor of Jews and looked upon them very kindly.
Well, the Whigs obviously were, because they were the people who put forward the bill.
Yes.
At the time. So Yes, you mentioned Plymouth before. I just wanted to add that Rabbi Lister, our own rabbi, goes to goes to Plymouth every summer, apart from
Yes,
last summer during the pandemic, and he spends a fortnight down there. So he's well known there, and they are well known to him. So a community that continues to this day.
No, Plymouth has this interesting, has a most beautiful shul flat there. So you stay in the shul flat, provided you'll take the service over Shabbos.
That must be it.
I've spent many happy Shabbatot in Plymouth, not in the flat. And at one stage, I used to go to Plymouth every year for Purim to read the Megillah. It's a lovely community.
How valuable is the research and obviously the book by Todd Endelman on this subject? And
The Jews of Georgia and England.
Yeah,
it's superb. All of Todd Endelman's stuff is superb. I've heard him lecture a couple of times. He has a view of Anglo-Jewish history, which is very interesting and very refreshing. And he's not afraid to think outside the box. It's first class.
Yeah, especially given the fact that he's American.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a question from Jerry. If you would like to unmute yourself,
Jerry Crest.
There is one.
Jerry Crest knows you. You know Jerry Crest?
There he is.
Hello, Elkan. I don't know whether you remember me from Marbella, Estepona. We were in touch.
Yes. Yes.
You were a great support to us in the early days. It's fantastic to listen to you and to see you on my screen. It's unbelievable. And I just wanted you to know that there are so many links between us, like Eva and John Hirsch of Plymouth community. And you do know them, don't you? Yeah.
Yes.
And I mean, I think you were friendly with Solomon Levy in Gibraltar.
Yes, that's Rabbi Abraham Levy's brother.
That's right. Fabulous guy. And the Fausts and the Posners from Oxford and Cheltenham, and so many links that we have. And it's thank you for a lovely talk. Very enjoyable.
The Jacobs family, who were in Spain, Mike and
Jackie, I have in fact emailed you because they're living in Netanya now.
It's all right. I've had lunch with them.
Oh, there you are.
My partner is very friendly with them,
and
I've come to know them quite very well.
Delightful couple. Yeah. And I've got many friends in Netanya, so I'm sure you've met several of them. Yeah.
Oh. You've got somebody, I think, that grew up with you. Gwendolyn Lamb.
Hello. I owe you a phone call.
You've got to demute yourself.
Gwendolyn.
When?
Do you remember me from Morton Hall when we were 14 on holiday at Morton Hall with Hannah and Howard Levy?
Yeah.
You remember? Whatever happened to Hannah and Harold? Are they still alive? Do you know?
No, they died within a week of each other.
Oh, a week of it. Oh well.
Within a week of each other, they had no children.
No.
And they died within a week of each other. I knew him very well because he was the warden of Jews College.
Yes, he was.
And although I didn't live in the college, I often went up into his flat. And the first time I remember staying up all night for a Shavuot limud all night was in his flat in Jews College.
Yeah.
Going down to the shul to daven at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Oh my goodness. They were from Scotland, both of them, weren't they? They were Scottish.
He was. I'm not sure she was.
Oh, right. And you say you're very interested in the Freemasons. Are there a lot of Jews still in Freemasonry in Britain? Are there still a lot of Jewish members?
Yes. Yes. A lot of them in Britain. and of course here in Israel.
In Israel, do you have Freemasonry in Israel? Oh, I didn't know that.
Very much so.
Really? And a lot of members, yeah?
Not a lot, but it's very interesting and very active. I'm involved in that as well.
Oh, marvelous. How long have you been living in Netanya now then? How long have you been living there now? 10
years.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you.
So you remember me.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank
Very
you.
nice.
There's a comment here from Gillian Linden. The subject of the slave trade has been given a much higher profile in the last 2 years, possibly longer actually. Has your research unearthed any direct involvement by the Jewish community in this trade?
There was some involvement. I've not looked at it in any detail, but there was involvement in the triangle trade, without any doubt. Most people were involved in the triangle, in slave trade at one stage or another. I don't want to get involved in the Jewish community in America and the American Civil War, which is another subject in which I'm very interested, where there were major differing views about slavery, very much so within the Jewish community. But it's one of the things that we need to avoid, it seems to me, is to put 21st century morality onto 18th century life, because the world ain't like that. Things that people looked at as quite normal 200 years ago are regarded by us today as not being normal. But it doesn't mean that we have to try and rewrite history, because the truth is that you can't.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Out of interest, you mentioned that the Great Synagogue was destroyed in the Blitz in 1941. What happened to the land? What stands there now? Or what happened immediately after? Did they try to rebuild it, or what happened?
They set up, the United Synagogue set up a temporary hut in the ruins. But after the war, the Jewish community in the East End was a shadow of its former self. The United Synagogue took over the old Yiddish theatre building in Ardler Street and called it the Great Synagogue Duke's Place. And that existed until, I would think, the 1980s. And I know that because I taught Edmund de Rothschild's sons their bar mitzvah, and the bar mitzvahs took place in that little shul, the Great Synagogue Duke's Place, because the Rothschilds were almost hereditary wardens of the shul. But then they just closed it. In the end, the United Synagogue closed it down. There are some quite interesting photographs of the inside of the Great Synagogue after it was bombed. And one of the things that is very moving is the following. There was some detailed plaster molding above the Oren Kodesh, above the Ark, and that molding survived the bombing, and you can still see it in the bombed pictures. You can see exactly where you are in the shul. In an odd sort of way, it's not been a bad thing, because one of the problems that the Sephardim have had, I think, is maintaining Bevis marks in an area where there is almost no local Jewish life. and the same thing would have happened to the Great Synagogue. I remember when they unveiled a plaque outside the site of the Great Synagogue, Seymour Saidman was president, and I went along. And if I remember rightly, it has the wrong date on it. It says September 41, but it wasn't. It was the last night of the Blitz, 10th of May, 1941. And the other synagogue that was destroyed that night was the Central Synagogue in Great Portland Street. 2 shuls went in one night. And so, of course, did the House of Commons.
Well, it seemed to me that the 100 Georgian years seemed to be quite comfortable for the Jews. They seemed to be wealthy Jews. Okay, I don't know the percentages and so on, but where did they all come from, and where did the money come from?
Most of the Jews were economic migrants from North Germany.
So that they were Ashkenazim.
They were Ashkenazim. The Sephardim kept on having immigrants coming in, but their numbers remained pretty static, which suggests that the number of people who joined are just about balanced by those who left because of outmarriage or something. The Ashkenazim came from North Germany. They came because you have to remember that one of the peculiarities about Anglo-Jewish history is the way that we were allowed back in, or more to the point, the way that we were expelled in 1290. When Edward I expelled the Jews, he did it by what's called an act of royal prerogative. It was always believed that there was an act of parliament that had expelled the Jews. And when Cromwell called the Whitehall Conference in December 1655, in answer to Manasseh ben Israel's petition for the Jews to be allowed to settle, the first question he asked the 2 leading judges was, what is the act of parliament that stops Jews from settling here? And the answer is the 2 judges came forward. They said there's no act of parliament. This was an act of the royal prerogative, and it only applied to the Jews who were in England in 1290. There is no reason that Jews should not settle here. And the Whitehall Conference decided nothing else. So the effect was that when the Jews came in, there were no special conditions. Everybody had expected there to be special conditions. Manasseh ben Israel had expected that Jews would only be allowed to settle in certain areas, and they'd only be allowed to pursue certain trades, and there'd be certain taxes and so on. None of that ever happened. So in the middle of the 18th century, when the Jews in North Germany were being discriminated against, or they were finding it difficult or whatever, the idea of coming to England was great because there were no restrictions on them. And until 1771, you could cross the North Sea on the post boats for nothing. The mails were important. Passengers were just allowed to join on. We know, for instance, about all sorts of people who crossed from Germany into one of the Medway ports, and then girls who were brought in a very respectable way, and who were then taken down to the West Country, to Exeter or to Plymouth, to meet in a very respectable way the young men to whom they had become engaged. So that's how a lot of the immigration came. We even know there was one court case which involved a Jew from Germany who didn't speak a lot of English, and the judge said to him, well, how do you trade? He said, I sort of gesture. And that's how the whole thing developed.
Was it not the case that a lot of the Jews who were rich sought to be part of the upper class, but then there were an awful lot of poor Jews who turned to crime and were part of the lower class and turned to other areas of it? So it wasn't all rich Jews in this country.
No, it was not all rich Jews. One of the trades that became Jewish was old clothes. You have to remember that this is in the days before mass-produced clothing, so everything has to be bespoke. So somebody who was very rich would have clothes made for him, and after a couple of years, he'd give it to his servant, who might sell it, and it would go to somebody in the middle classes. And after a couple of years, it would go back into the market to somebody in the lower classes. And there was a big clothing market called Rag Fair near the Tower of London. And there's a wonderful account by an American in 1805 who said, don't walk through Rag Fair, and whatever you do, don't stop, because if you stop, they'll have the coat off your back before you know what's going on.
Yeah.
A lot of Jews. I don't know whether you said it or I read it somewhere. That there were a lot of Jews in London, but a lot of them moved away. And you know, when you start talking about obviously Cornwall, which has got an enormous amount of Jews in those years, but they sort of, you know, normally it's people. London's a magnet to people, but it seemed to be maybe that when they were doing well, maybe then they left London and went somewhere else.
Partly, I don't know if they were doing well, actually, perhaps because they weren't doing well. So they moved. There were a lot of little communities. Almost none of them were 1,000 people. Plymouth might have been, Portsmouth certainly was. But even communities like Falmouth were probably just slightly over 100. There were small communities. There's the beginning of settlement in Manchester. There's some settlement in the port towns on the east coast. There's some settlement in Newcastle. There's the beginning of some sort of trade in Glasgow, partly as the result of the 1745 rebellion being crushed. A lot of Highlanders come down to Glasgow and they start dealing with Jews because Jews have gone into the tobacco trade. So the community is growing. The first Jewish community in South Wales is Swansea, not Cardiff. One of the people who subscribed to that 1796 Shavuot Machzor that I told you lived in Swansea.
They have a very old show in Merthyr Tydfil as well.
Yeah, but that's
Is that later?
Yeah, it's later. It's 19th century.
Oh.
Merthyr Tydfil developed because the Merthyr Tydfil, Bryn Mawr, a whole lot of communities up there developed because the Jews were running this sort of cash and carry, not cash and carry, but credit, a sort of credit drapery business. And the miners got paid on Friday, so the Jews wanted to be around to collect their money on Friday. And that gave them problems getting back to Swansea or Cardiff for Shabbos. That's why the little Jewish communities in the valleys developed, because they were frum and they needed to be around on Fridays in order to get the money.
Well, what was the, would you know what the population of Jews were in that sort of, that 100 years? It's difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a guess it might have been up to 50,000, but I doubt it. It's very difficult. That sort of Jewish, those Jewish statistics are very, very difficult to come about.
Okay, I think
there are no questions, David.
Well, I must just say something that I think one of the funniest lines you came up with in your talk was about call-ups. Even 400 years ago, they're still arguing, and today they're still arguing about call-ups. I thought that was very, very funny.
Oh, absolutely! It's exactly the same business. We weren't being called up often enough.
It's the oldest word in Judaism is broigus.
Unfortunately, that's true.
Probably.
Okay, can we leave? I've got one more question for you, and that is there anyone from that period that you would like to meet?
David Nieto. He was the Chacham of Bevis Marks. Very, very learned Italian. He was a doctor. He was a scientist. He was a polymath, and he was actually known in London society for being so clever. I would have liked to have met David Nieto.
One day. You never know. You never know. Okay, I think it's very late. We haven't been in the street for a very long time. Oh no, I've got somebody wants to come. And Angela, it must be your sister. I don't know. Okay, David, would you like to wind it up?
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Elkan.
I've got plenty of questions, but
thank you, Elkan, for a most interesting discussion on the history of Georgian England, taking us back in time. And thank you for that. And also bearing in mind that you are some 2 hours ahead of us as well at the moment. So it's relatively late. I would like to just let everybody know that next week we have Amanda Weinberg with us. She wrote a book called The Tears of Monterini. It's about a village in Italy, somewhere between Pisa and Rome. It's called Pitigliano. It's a small Jewish population, but it's fascinating place. It's worthwhile having a look on Google at some of the pictures of the town itself. It's just surprised you to see the fact that it's still standing. It's a medieval town, and it's absolutely fascinating. And Amanda will be here next week to tell us about that, and it's from her book. I would like to thank you all for being with us this evening and wish you well. And Elkan, if you are still with us, obviously I wish you well. And we look forward to seeing you in the flesh at some point, whether it's back here in Edgware or in Israel. And again, thank you, everybody. And I will pass you back to David.
Did your son make it here?
My son?
Yeah. Wasn't he?
He certainly did at the beginning of the evening.
Oh, I see. I didn't realise that.
My Machatenister, Angela Landau, is here.
Landau is a very special surname.
I know that.
It's a very common one, isn't
Yeah.
Yeah, I know Julian certainly was logged in at the beginning because I saw him.
I think people are going home now. Okay, if we'll continue just chatting amongst ourselves.
Yes, and, David, I'll pass you hosting because I need to leave.
Where are you going now? Okay. Wherever you're going, Gager's into hate.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's 11:30. I'm going to bed. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's 9:30. I'm going to bed shortly.
Okay, well,
bye.
We can do a little bit more of entertainment.
Okay. Bye, David. I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. The floor is yours.
Well, the floor is mine. Hold on. Let's see who we've got left. You've got to, oh, John Stillett. I haven't seen you for a long time. You've got to,